also, just so you
Okay.
know, I was in ministry track. I had intended to be a full-time minister for my entire life. And so that adds an extra layer of being watched and um, just observed all the time. So, I mean, I didn't know it was a crack yet when I first started doing this. Back around 2000, I was working in a church setting and was really wanting to help my people pray better. Like they were bored because we'd sit around tables and share requests and pray on Wednesday night, and then we'd do that on Sunday night, and then we'd do that in Sunday school. And that was really the only mode that we had. And I just felt like there's got to be something more. And so I was really risque and brought in a labyrinth so we could walk it together. And we like did some writing exercises together and even played with Play-Doh as part of a way of learning to pray. And I thought I was being really creative. But what I found out was this was actually happening in lots of other places, and it was the emergent church movement. And I didn't find that out until probably close to 2010. So I knew there was other stuff going on, but it took a while to get there. And part of this, I mentioned to Tom that slowed this down for me is I like to describe the Church of the Nazarene as a fishbowl that's been painted black on both sides, the inside and the outside. So you can get curious about something and you scratch away at that paint. But if someone hasn't tried to look in, I can't see out. And so that's part of why it took me a long time to put the pieces together through this. And once I started to see out, then I knew, like, wait a minute, there's a bigger world out here. You mean there's other Christians that can go to heaven? There's other types of worship music. There's other ways to preach. Um, it was all novel and exciting to me because I did not know any of that. I had been Nazarene through and through and only until I was about probably 35, 34. So,
The analogy of the fishbowl is really good. But what it tells me is that someone had a scratch on the outside as well. So somebody sort of was reaching in and say, "Hey, Janelle, you should check this out." So talk a little bit about those people and what that experience was like.
yeah, it's interesting. I think one memory that comes to mind is we did have, we had college professors that were in our Nazarene universities, which means they knew there was a bigger world. They weren't always real open with sharing that with us, but I do think when I found out about the prayer stuff, it was probably through Ed Robinson, who was one of our teen mentors and leaders. Um, but really, what really opened the door for me was I got invited to participate in a leadership training and met a bunch of people that were kind of Nazarene adjacent. And once I met them, that started opening up some more questions and realizing there was a bigger world out there. And I mean, that was probably the real beginning for me. And then we attended a church called Jacobswell in Kansas City, which was at the time a pretty big emergent church. And so we would sit up in the balcony so no one would see us. And then one time we showed up and there were other Nazarenes there and we all freaked out. I'm not kidding you. We're like, oh crap, now what do we do? And so we kind of all huddled together and we're like, okay, you're not telling anyone, right? And we're like, we're not telling anyone. And had an agreement. And it was probably 6 or 8 months before we went down to the regular area of the church because we were afraid of being seen.
Hmm.
So that slowed things down. When you're too afraid to even be seen somewhere else, it does slow the process.
Wow. So I know we've had discussions and you've shared some of this with me, and I wondered if you'd be open to share a little bit about this process, this deconstruction process, or your experiences within that faith community as it relates to mental health and trauma. Because I mean, what you're describing sounds like there's a lot of trauma that's included in, to be afraid to, stuff like that. I'm just curious if you'd be willing to share, some of the things how that affected you.
Absolutely.
Looking back at it now,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the thing I want to just say up front. Like these awarenesses don't come when you're going through it. They come later when you've done some reading and encountered things. So when I talk about the way that the church hurt me, I also want to acknowledge to you that, like, I know that we did good work. I know we did good work. I know we did make a difference for some people. And I know that there are good memories and events that I went to that were favorable. So I don't want that to get lost in this. Like my best friend from Kansas City, I met her in one of those churches. And so we've been doing this journey together for a while. And my friend Joey had muscular dystrophy, and we basically, my husband and I were in the small group that basically raised him from the time he was just kind of in a regular wheelchair to all the way through to the end of his life. And though I can't separate those things out from the fact that that happened in church and with my church family, and there were good things. But looking back, especially as someone in ministry, it was just a lot of control. One of the ways that I recently was introduced to this was the idea of fog, which is fear, obligation, and guilt. And that's a control mechanism that psychologists talk about with certain personality types. But it very much fits in with how I lived life, how my husband lived life when we were going through this. There was always this sense of obligation that as ministerial students, as ministers in the church, that we had to be examples at all times, at every moment, that we needed to stay busy and be committed, because our commitment could be questioned if we weren't there 5 times a week or more. This may sound a little bit like an exaggeration, but lately one of the conversations that come up is people recognizing that, like, the church used us up in our 20s and 30s and used up all that energy we had. And now we're all 40 and we, hurt when we get out of bed in the morning and are going like, you used us up and then you just let us go. You didn't even say goodbye. And so that kind of, that's abusive. I don't have any other word for it. And along with that, one of the things that opened this door in awareness for me, my husband works at a large tech company and was helping do some of their DEI work early on, and read a book by Shankar Vedantam called The Hidden Brain. And The Hidden Brain talks about forms and types of unconscious bias. And in that book, there's a chapter on cults. And he was recounting to me what he read, and he said, sometimes, with suicide bombers and people that are in certain kinds of clubs and missionaries experience this kind of behavior. And I'm like, wait, what? Rewind. Mm-hmm. And he went back to the part about missionaries, and that I like have the picture in my head of where I was sitting on the chair in the living room, and just all of a sudden things just shifted for me of, wait a minute, that behavior that we were part of, that we were receiving, was cult-like. So here's the deal. Nobody likes that word. Nobody wants to think they were part of that. Nazarenes didn't really have a uniform. I could buy clothes at the store. I didn't have to keep my hair long. But a cult, this is a sociological category, and what often defines a cult is separation from society, separation from loved ones, strict controls over how you move through the world. And the church that I was in and the church that many ex-evangelicals were in was very cult-like. And I think that has become a piece that the more I listen to these stories, the more of these conversations I have, the more we just have to start calling this what it was. It was unhealthy. It was mentally controlling. It often divided families. It divided my husband from his family. Um, and the healing that has to take place coming out of this is many times the same kind of trauma healing that you have to do with abuse victims, the deprogramming. And I, like, even right now in this moment, I don't like saying this out loud to you. I don't want it to be this way. But I think right now there is enough evidence about this that this is what many of us experienced. And so, how do you deal with that? For me, that's been in community, finding other people like me that have gone through this. Ryan and I have talked about this. We just released actually a podcast episode on this because we have a little different angles going into this, but still share many of the same stories and experiences. So having that community factor is key. I've been in therapy for years and years. My husband and I are working through some stuff as well because sometimes people don't just deconstruct at the same rate. So we're seeing that happen for lots of couples where they have to kind of work through this stuff. And just relearning how to think about the world. Like, I didn't really know I was allowed to have hobbies. I didn't really know. I was told that, I could be a preacher and that was it. And even to the point where I was told that you can either be a musician or a preacher, you need to pick. Unless you're going to be a revivalist, and then you can do both. But otherwise, your singing has to be secondary. And I had an offer to audition at Juilliard at the end of college and turned it down because I was called to preach and I had to go to seminary. And no one in my life in the Nazarene world said, wait a second, you might want to think about that opportunity. And so, let me say this too. This is a good caveat. I'm not saying all this is everybody else's fault, okay? I know that I didn't do everything right either. But the really hard part about unconscious abuse and trauma and discrimination is that you don't know what it is until you get the words for it. And I didn't get the words for this until I was well into my 30s. And so I couldn't describe what was happening to me. And I think you find that with a lot of people. So it is a rebuilding of your personhood coming out of these traditions. So.
Well, tell us a little bit about kind of the linchpin of moving beyond that. We talk here at Way Forward. How do we move beyond that trauma and deconstruction and those challenges we've been that we've had. What was kind of the linchpin that moved you in a different direction? And maybe it's a good segue to talk about brew theology and kind of the origins of that.
Yeah. So I'll give a shout out to my friend Kathy Escobar. She has a church here in Denver, and she wrote a book called Faith Shift. And if you are in the midst of this or know someone going through it, I can't recommend it enough. This resource was actually pretty key to my own story. Those early shifts before we moved to Denver 10 years ago helped me open up and see a bigger world. But to really start processing things was her work. And I was in a bad enough place after our first church here in Denver that we left in 2015 that I literally went over to her church and asked her to talk to me. And I did not know her because I didn't know what else to do. I was so lost. And she did. And I'm so thankful for that. But that Faith Shift book gives you the stories of many people that have been through this, what things came to light for them, what things they had to re-examine. It's very personable, and it was a huge turning point for me in starting to process internally what happened. For me, the unconscious bias stuff was another big key. It just, part of that's my personality. I totally admit this. I like to know how things work. So learning about how unconscious bias functions in the middle of religion, in the middle of all of that, was super helpful to me. It might bore you out of your mind, and that's okay. But it was helpful for me. Um, and so between those two things, the other thing that happened was I had a friend from that first church we went to in Denver who said, "Hey, I met this guy and he's doing this thing in pubs and I want you to come." And I'm like, "Dan, I don't go to breweries. No, I don't do that." Where did that bias come from? Nazarenes don't drink. So like the thought of going somewhere to a pub to talk, like way outside my wheelhouse, not something I'd ever done. We did discover that I am very good at drinking and can handle my alcohol very well, which is, ironic to say the least. And you would not believe how many Nazarenes come to brew theology. It's awesome. It really is. Um, but so I came, and when I was there, I was very nervous, and I met Ryan Miller, who is my co-director of brew theology. And Ryan's an ex-evangelical like me, ex-pastor, and was just starting his journey of being a stay-at-home dad. So both of us were kind of in this place where we weren't working. This community was starting to form. And so Ryan asked me to join him in leadership. And so we started putting together brew theology out of that. If Dan had not kept bugging me for months, like he must have bugged me for 6 months to get me to give in to go, like to drive down to Denver and drink and talk to people, it just didn't compute. And I'm really thankful he kept bugging me. And so with that, we started with a lot of Christian topics, a lot of kind of theology, philosophy, a little social justice here and there. But one of our main attendees was Buddhist. And so she encouraged us to talk about those issues. And then we met someone through the Interfaith Alliance in Colorado. And next thing you knew, we had a Sikh come talk to us, and we had a transgender person come talk to us, and then we had a Muslim come talk with us. And pretty soon, Ryan and I both, as we kind of were journeying through this deconstruction, this phase, we're like, this interfaith thing makes a lot of sense. This is good. Because this is where we focus on our similarities between other traditions. This is where we focus on how does religion help make the world a better place? And that became a key for us. And then Dan had the idea that we should do a podcast. And so when you listen to our podcast, you're basically hearing the conversations that we have around the table on Thursday night. The very newest episodes, and for a little while, are just Ryan and I, but you'll still get a sense of what the feel is. Very unstructured, very much about sharing our experiences with each other. So that's kind of where brew theology began. And then since then, we've gone to several festivals. We've been to the Wild Goose Festival, which is a great place to go if you are wanting to experience kind of the other side of Christianity. And Ryan will be flying today or tomorrow to Atlanta to host a conversation with Otis Moss III on Black preaching through McAfee School of Theology. So we're really thankful for those kind of opportunities that push us and help us continue to do work in this space and hopefully invite people into a conversation that they might not have somewhere else.
Talk a little bit about how brew theology kind of expanded from just one group to multiple groups in Denver and in other parts of the country. How that all kind of transpire?
Yeah, I mean, that was really Wild Goose. So Wild Goose Festival it's been around, I think, a little more than 10 years. They meet in North Carolina in the middle of July. It's lovely, I tell you. And so we went and hosted a booth and met a bunch of people. And out of that, we had 4 leaders sign up. And so we've had a group in Raleigh. So we have 3 groups in Florida right now. Ryan just opened Waco because that's where he moved to 2 years ago. We've had several in different locations. And what we try to offer is we have training materials and all the curriculum. I've got over 150 topics that you can use to run a group for brew theology. And we're there to just help you do it. We ask a very small amount of money, like $5, $10 a month for the materials, and would love to see it continue to expand. It has contracted during COVID. I haven't been too worried about it because this is just the new reality we've been living in, and I think it's pretty natural for things to mend and move and change in the midst of that. So hopefully, as we head back out and start reaching out to new folks, we'll be able to see that grow some more.
Okay. Well, I don't know if anybody else has some questions.
What would you say is the sort of drawing point for everybody who goes to that in terms of their theology? Is it pretty much just because they're coming from something they didn't like, or I don't know. I know for our community, like the Universal Christ discussion with Richard Rohr has been very big in terms of moving us to a different place. I'm just wondering, for you and for that group, how did that works?
Yeah, we're about 50% ex-evangelicals, and then, well, we're probably about 30% that. We're about 50% atheist and agnostic, and then a smattering of other people in between. And I think the way I'd answer that now, having walked with people through their stories, is while not everybody cares about religion, like organized religion, the same way, everybody cares about being human and sharing this planet and figuring out how to do that well. And so whether that's from a Stoic perspective or a Buddhist perspective, we're really trying to wrestle with what are the things that give life meaning? What are the ways that we can find connection with other people? How can we make the world around us a better place? And there's a lot to be said for the relationships. I think, if many of our people have experienced some sort of religion, at least in their youth, and we help provide a community for them. It sounds very similar to, maybe what your community is like. We don't fit where we used to. We might have moved a lot from where we used to be, but we still care about people and want to work together and figure out how to do this better. And I think that's a big part of it. Plus, we're at kind of an intellectual outlet. There isn't always space to talk about theology at work or social justice issues or, Kierkegaard. But we try to cover lots of different kinds of ground at Brew Theology so different people can step in and participate in those conversations. Other questions? Yeah.
Is Stephen actually here, or is it just
He's
like
listening.
an empty couch?
He's listening. He's just
Okay.
Good question. That's just his icon.
I understand that much.
It just seemed
You
to
gonna be
fit.
there?
Yeah, we're here.
Okay.
Janelle, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I have come through Nazarene. I actually know the great granddaughter of Phineas Brzee, who is now not Nazarene at all. I thought you might get a giggle out of that.
Yeah.
In fact, she's kind of wandering in the desert and is new to Christian mysticism. But, and my parents were missionaries, just to add another cluster on top of that. And I'm curious, I love the term ex-evangelical, but I'm wondering, because I'm sure you had a lot of like Bible messages, do you feel like you've come to a place where you've been able to pull together, not even sure how to ask this, maybe a theology that makes sense for you, that you can somehow, do you know what I'm asking? I'm
Yeah.
not sure. Like something that makes sense from where you are, enough separated from the past to be livable?
I think so. Sometimes it does depend on the day. But another piece of this story is that through my connections with Brew Theology, I was able to connect into the larger interfaith community in Colorado. And man, those people, they have loved on me in a way that I didn't know I needed. I was able to go to the Parliament of the World's Religions with them in 2018, which is the largest interfaith meeting in the world. Over 8,000 people were there. And what came out of that is I was invited into community with interfaith leaders around Denver. And they have listened to my story, and they've acknowledged my ministry and my work in a way that never was acknowledged in my church. And they have really helped me see that really working through our similarities, finding resonance between our traditions, this is how we make a difference in the world. And with that, as a side note, comes my strong commitment to working on climate issues as a way to also help take care of our shared humanity. But in that, I think what I would say to you is, as Tom knows, I still will at Brew Theology, we label ourselves when we introduce. You don't have to, but just to know who's in the room. And so I will still call myself a progressive Christian. I have no problem, and I don't think Jesus has any problem going to the interfaith table with me. And so I think that, do I have a full theology? No, probably not. But Jesus is not the problem for me. The church was the problem. And so he and I have kind of walked through this, and we go sit at these tables together. I don't read my Bible a lot at this point in my life. Prayer during COVID, kind of for me morphed into lighting candles for my friends that were sick and on the edge of death, and trying to stay present and in the moment of caring for them in that way. I have a list of names up on my wall over here that are people that have either been in the hospital or been, really fighting that battle and just trying to work on that awareness. I know that's not a robust theology, but praying, if prayer worked the way we thought it did, we wouldn't have Ukraine and we wouldn't have the wackos in Texas hurting trans kids. So God and I are still negotiating on that. But I was a Christian when I went to church the first week after I was born. I was Nazarene for 35 years. Like, I think I've had to come to terms with, I can't really outrun that. I know people that do go to different traditions. They become Buddhists, they become something else. So far, I have not been able to really cross that bridge. So I try to glean from my interfaith leader friends. I have deep, deep respect for my rabbi friends, and the way they view the world and the way they view the text has been so inspiring to me. And I think being a good human is really part of it. And I don't think that's selling out to humanism. I think that's looking at Jesus, because he came to the earth to be a good human. He came so that God could experience what it's like to be part of this world. And so I don't see being a good human as anything less than being a good Christian. So I think there's definitely a challenge now too with calling ourselves Christians, because that word doesn't mean what it used to mean. So still wrestling through a lot of that.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Very honest. And I appreciate that. I appreciate you sharing your story and your journey and your current struggles too. Thank you.
Yeah. I think one thing too I'd add is if you've heard of process theology or open and relational theology, that's kind of the theological camp that I've landed in, which is it's a very organic way of viewing how God interacts with the world and the relationship that we have with Him, with ourselves, and with others. That what does it mean to look like, to have a healthy relationship with God, one that has give and take, one that has interaction, where I was raised in a world where pretty much God decided everything. And if God didn't answer your prayer, then you weren't worthy. That's pretty abusive shit. So I really like thinking more of God as someone that I can have a real relationship with as an adult and figure out how do we walk through this experience together. Sorry about cussing. It happens.
Thank you for that too. That's awesome.
What's the hope of the Brew Theology gatherings?
Yeah, I mean, our hope is to help people, I think, develop that side of themselves that maybe they don't have another outlet for. Providing a healthy space where we can have hard conversations. Definitely that conversation piece has become critical in the last, 6-8 years we've been living in. How do we learn to sit down at the table with somebody we don't agree with? And how do we do that respectively? So our number one rule is don't be a jerk, or whatever word you want to put in there. Respect each other, listen well, listen more than you talk, respect each other's humanity. All conversations are on the table. And I think this flies in the face of maybe what some of us were raised with, of you don't talk politics and religion. I don't think I have to point out to any of you that didn't turn out so well. So let's try to learn how to speak well with each other and to sit around hard things. We have only had to intervene maybe 3 times in 6 years in a conversation where there was someone disrespecting someone else to the point that it required intervention. So what that gives me hope for and tells me is we can adult and do this. It is possible. Do the most conservative people come to Brew Theology? No, not usually. But I can help the people that are around me work on these conversational skills so that we might go and share that in other venues that we're in. For example, Rob, who is my co-leader here in Denver, has a lot of more conservative friends and family. And I just love it when he comes back and tells stories about how he's able to just sit in those spaces now and listen and learn and ask questions instead of getting into arguments. I think that is part of the hope of what we do. And, the more you learn, the more you know what you don't know, the better we are at connecting with others and listening and just showing up better. And I think that's really important.
Janelle, this is Stephen, the couch picture on your screen.
Yeah.
And coming to you from the state full of wackos. I'm coming to you from Fort Worth, Texas. So
okay.
With a shared frustration and sadness at the governance that we're getting right now. But that is not what my question's about. I certainly intrigued by the interfaith dialogue you're talking about and can relate a lot to your story in terms of just moving from an evangelical Christianity away from that. And I've heard you talk quite a bit about religion in Brew Theology as well. And so I'm kind of curious, like in my own life, as I have moved away from evangelicalism, I feel like I've also moved away from religion and always maybe had a complicated relationship with that word. But so how is religion playing into Brew Theology? And especially if it's potentially showing a positive thing. I heard you kind of mention that a little bit, like the value of it. What is the value of religion as opposed to setting that aside for your interfaith dialogue?
Yeah, I think it's, I don't think there's one answer on this one. Many people decide to walk away from religion completely, and I totally get that. And don't ever pressure anyone to stay in a situation they're not comfortable with. I do think the reality is, though, that religion is part of the human experience. Like, we're not going to outrun this. Religion is something that many people practice, and religion, especially in America, especially Christianity, is so deeply ingrained in the way that we have formed community up until maybe the 1970s and 80s is when things, I think, started to change. You know, this is a little digression, but I hope it'll give a little context. You know, when the Puritans came here, they were outrunning religious oppression in their own form. But what they brought here was also then that they got rid of everybody that didn't conform. So not the greatest transition. But they are rooted in the foundation of what we believe religion should mean in public life. And through the development of our culture, the development of capitalism, they're kind of intertwined in that. And so the church became the center of the town. The church became the place where you meet people to do business with, where you find community, where you find partners for your children. And we can't outrun our history. It's a unique history that doesn't exist in other parts of the world. Along with that, we have the series of revivals that took place in the 1800s. And these revivals really formed the way that we treat religion in this country. So if you were an outcast or if you were not living well, you would go to the tent revival, you would get saved, go down to the altar, commit your life to Christ, join a small group, and your life was transformed. And then you had kids and you were pretty strict with them, but then they had kids that were kind of like, meh, whatever. So then it was time for another revival. And this repeated itself, we know, at least 3 times. And I would go on to say, I think Billy Graham is part of a continuation of that happened throughout the 1900s. And I think it's fallen apart in a way that we can't quite name yet. But this idea that we have to have this stricter, recommitted, legalistic way of practicing a religion that really focuses on Christianity and the way that this country is Christian, you know, we're seeing the outflow of how that doesn't work. But but we can't escape it. And so if I'm going to be Christian, because that's where I come from and that's what a lot of my people have experienced, is there anything to salvage out of that? And so for me, by interacting with interfaith, I've seen a picture of how that can work well. Like, do unto others as you would have them do unto you is in every religion. Sometimes it's in the negative. Don't do to others as you wouldn't do to yourself. Sometimes it's usually it's in the positive, and sometimes the wording is a little different. But that is a major connecting point between all traditions. You know, one of those that inspired me during early COVID is the Sikh communities around the country, and instantly were providing meals for strangers. Instantly started coming together to take care of others. All right, guess what? I can get on board with that as a Christian, and I'll even wear a headscarf while I'm doing it, because we're making the world a better place. And if you knew my feminism at all, you would know for me to say what I just said, it has taken some growth. But anyway, I won't digress into that. I think the only way that we can impact religion and help it be better is if we stay engaged with it. And so for me, that means working with interfaith. I totally don't expect everyone else to be able to do that at all. I am also very careful not to engage Theo bros on the internet, because I'm not good at doing that well either. There are things that we each are built for, things that we each can do better. And so while I might focus on interfaith and finding, you know, ways to work through that system, I'm totally like, I'll support you 100% if arguing on the internet is your thing and you're good at it and you enjoy it, because that's not what I'm good at. So I think there are different pathways for people. And I also think walking away is a, a totally honest option. I do think, though, people long for community, whether it's religious community or non-religious community. And I think that can be as life-giving as anything else. Shankar Vedantam, as I said, has been really influential in my journey, and his latest book called Useful Delusions talks about, and one of the aspects of that is people stay in religion even when they start to feel uncomfortable, because that's their family, that's their community. And I hear this all the time in evangelical circles. I don't know anyone else going through this. I feel so alone. And so part of what Brew Theology does is try to at least give a space where you can connect with those other people. And there are lots of ministries doing that work. And so we are not alone in that. This is just our particular flavor. Does that cover it, or is there something more specific you'd like me to address?
No, I think that's great. Thank you. Just hopeful to hear how the specific religions do or don't fit into the interfaith and theological dialogue you guys are having. But that's a great answer. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What was the word you used? Theobros?
Yeah. So Theobros are a special set of people that they're usually Calvinist, hardcore, fundamentalist Calvinist evangelicals that especially hate women ministers. And they love to troll on the internet. That's their life's work, I think. So I have learned that that's not good for my blood pressure, and also like I'm not good at quick responses. So I just don't do that. I have some women friends that can kick them down the mountain, and it's fun to watch, but it's not me. I have a great friend. She's a PhD candidate in Dayton, and she really doesn't worry about anything, and she will just take them down. And, she's the sweetest, funniest, like lighthearted person, and she just like takes them off at the knees theologically, and it's so fun to watch. Anything else?
I don't know if I can.
When you said the fog, F was for fear, O was for obligation, G was
Guilt.
thank you.
I don't know if I can articulate this, so this might not go anywhere.
That's okay.
Just thinking of Stephen's question, religion is largely an endeavor of form, and some of what I've heard you saying so far is an experience of the constrictions of form, and pushing back against the form. Where does Brew Theology go outside of creating something that's just new form, which would in some ways be the heads to the tails, or the other side of the coin?
Right. I think first I would say that we have a feeling in America that like once you establish a church, it should be there forever. I mean, that no church wants to close down. But when you start looking at the statistics, and I bet they're very interesting after COVID, there are huge numbers of churches that are basically just alive at this point to help bury their oldest members, and then they're not going to exist anymore. And so with that reality in mind, are we another form? Yeah, probably. I mean, at its basest level, I think that's a fair critique. What I think that we, though, have brought to the table that's a little different is right now we are primarily a discussion group and we have online community with our friends that attend. We don't have any rituals really. I mean, except getting more beer halfway through. Um, but we don't marry and bury, though Ryan and I are both ordained and could do that work. We don't sing together. We don't really share meals together. So we don't have all of those things yet. Now Ryan and I have talked about, there was interest in what would it look like to have some sort of either worship's not actually quite the right word because we're not worshiping anything, but some sort of space where we could come together and share the things we're learning and reading and listening to, kind of like a church service, but loose, I guess. And I'm open to that. There's nothing wrong with, or there's nothing more foundational than sharing a meal together and then hanging out together around things you care about. And so I think that if we were to start doing something that sounds like maybe how your church developed, I could see that happening. And yeah, it's been done before. But also it's really people led. I mean, like you guys understand this, I think. It's people led. It's where do we want to go? What do we want to do next? And we'll do that as we, as a group, as we go forward. And I'm comfortable with that. I don't want Brew Theology to end, but if that were to be what happened at some point, I think I have learned enough to know that like there'll be something else then that'll come along. But I got to tell you, this has been probably some of the best years of my life with Brew Theology. I've grown and had experiences I would never had, and I've have a friendship that I would never have expected. You might have picked up on this. I'm an Enneagram 1, and Ryan's a 7, and so Ryan makes my life better for just being in it, and I am so thankful for that, because he's taught me how to take myself less seriously and how to show up and just be in the moment. And I don't know how I would have learned that somewhere else. And I see that among our people. They, different sets of people clumped together. Ryan hangs out with the sports people and I hang out with the nerdy people, and it's okay. It's good. It works. And I think that's another aspect of what we do that's really healthy and really different from church is we do practice authenticity and vulnerability. And I think any organization that wants to survive has to keep a finger on that. When we start stepping away from that, when we get hierarchical, when we get rigid, that's when that starts to fall away.
All right, well, it's 6:30. We typically wrap things up. But I just, I don't know if anybody else has any questions or.
I hope you know you're very refreshing.
Well, thank you.
I don't
appreciate
know
that.
what word you can even relate to, but I just have really enjoyed what you've had to say.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I did give Tom a list of resources. Feel free to contact me if you need anything. I'm up on the Brew Theology website. Also, I shared with Tom, and I'll share with you, it's in the very earliest stages, but I am working with a couple of friends to start sharing a Substack newsletter on some of these issues. And so, like I said, it's at the very earliest stages, but when that develops, I will let Tom know for the future.
Great.
Again, I don't know if I'll be able to articulate this well either, but my experience, you had a new term I'd never heard of before, but I always talk about Christian refugees. You had some other ex-evangelicals, I think you said.
Yep. Yeah,
How,
that word has kind of bubbled up online, especially in these last few years.
yeah. Uh, something that struck me for quite a while now is that the questions that are often important to folks, I came from that same world, but the questions often important to folks in that world are framed by that world.
Hmm.
And something that's been a bit confounding to me is that very often people coming out of that world still allow that world to frame their questions. And I'm curious what you would have to say to that, just because even recently I had a discussion with my dad, who's still very much in that world, but I said, well, an idea I have for a book sometime is to write a book titled "Your Questions Suck to Me."
Yeah.
Because they're not relevant, and for me personally, and I haven't really personally cared about those questions for a very long time. But in these discussions, those questions are still given a lot of power. And I can understand why, but I'm curious what Brew theology might do to endeavor to say, that's a question that we just don't need anymore, or it's not one that we need to, because it's framed by what we're not a part of.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think I know that we have some people that show up and just listen for a while. And I think sometimes that is what can start shifting their questions. I think here, the sad truth that I think we have to acknowledge is that many people will never transition out of those questions. And so the best thing I can do is I can listen. I can ask them more questions. Well, why do you feel that way? Here's a great question that helped me from that event that I went to many years ago. How's that working for you? Not in a snarky way, but in a real way. Like, let me see if I can. I think one place where this comes up is when there's just this very much this anti-woman in leadership thing, and you're like, well, how's that working for you? Like, how does that reflect your experience? Is that what you've really grown up with in your household? Is that really how you see the church functioning? I've been in churches where they're sold on that's not an option, but the people who run the church are women, and they're doing all the work and they're organizing everything. And so, I think it's being willing to sit with people in the midst of that and listen, hear some things you don't want to hear, that you don't agree with, and then trying to see, is there an openness there for them to have a bigger conversation? Ryan just said this. I just edited the podcast, and this is a good point. You have to be in the right place personally to have those conversations effectively. If you're just tired of those questions and are fed up with it, then it's probably not the time to have that conversation with someone, and that's okay. It's okay. We're not always in a headspace to deal with that. I think it never ever hurts to focus on, well, what does this mean with how we're treating another human being? It's one thing to scream about immigrants coming into our country undocumented. It's another thing when I'm giving them granola bars because they're putting siding on my house. I think getting people to come out of that big amorphous blob of rules that's around them and down into one-on-one interactions with reality, I think that's another way that you can start addressing some of those questions. For instance, my parents live in a tiny, tiny town in New Mexico, and they've received a refugee family from Afghanistan that doesn't speak English. And there's some pretty fundamentalist Christians in that group. And I asked my dad, I said, when they formed the committee to take care of this family, did they make it clear that there was to be no proselytizing? And my dad said that was the #1 rule. And so if you want to participate and claim that you're helping this refugee family, you're going to have to adult and not try to like ask them to convert to Jesus every time you see them. And you know what? You can do that without giving up your faith. So I think love them well, listen well, check out of the conversation if it's too much for you. It's okay to walk away. You're under no obligation to fix them. I know many times those are deep relationships that we want to influence, but we're not responsible for them in that way. Show up the best way you can, and that's enough. They'll come around if they want to come around, they will. If they want to be narrow-minded, there's not a lot we can do to undo that sometimes, and it's really sad.
Well, Janelle, I really, really appreciate you being a part of this conversation and sharing your time with us today.
Oh, anytime. I'm happy to. And feel free to reach out and ask any questions if they come up later.
And I'll probably see you Thursday.
Yep.
Yeah, for the next Brew Theology. So, cool.
All right. Thank you all so much.
Thanks so much, Janelle.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Everyone.
Bye, everyone. Nice to meet you.